Hello, fourth graders. This is lesson 10.1, Lines, Rays, and Angles. Please pause to write the lesson number and title in your notebook. Today's lesson objective is I can identify and draw points, lines, line segments, rays, and angles. Please pause again to write the I can statement in your notebook. All right, fourth graders, lesson 10.1 is our first lesson in geometry. We're going to be looking more at shapes in this unit. So today's lesson is a lot of vocabulary on what we call shapes. Let's begin by reading the Unlock the Problem. It says, everyday things can model geometric figures. For example, a period at the end of the sentence models a point. A solid painted stripe on the middle of a road can model a line. So here's one vocabulary word that we have. It's called a point. A point tells us an exact location in space. We model it by drawing like a period, like a little dot. And we label it so that we know what it is called with a letter. This point is labeled A. We would read that as saying point A. We would also write it down as saying point A. An example of that in real life would be like the point of a pencil, the very tip. Our next example is a line. A line says it's a straight path that continues, this is important, without end in both directions. So you can see on this line, it goes to the left and it goes to the right. And we assume that lines always go on and on and on forever because there's no stopping. And we would call this line BC because there's a B and a C. I could also call it line CB because the line goes in both directions, so the order is not important. So I would write that or read that as line BC or line CB. But when I write it, instead of saying point A like we did up above, this time I draw it with the letters and I draw it with a line over the top with arrows going each direction. So line BC or line CB. Our next vocabulary is a line segment, and that means when our line stops. A line segment is a part of the line between two end points. So instead of continuing on forever, like our line, a line segment stops on each end. Notice that there's no arrows going both directions. So we call this line segment DE, or we can call it line segment ED. So either direction, it's still called the same letters. So we would read that out loud as line segment DE or line segment ED. And when we write that, we write it with the letters underneath and just a straight line on top. No arrows going each direction because it is just a line segment. It stops on both ends. An example of that would be our yield sign here where it stops on the end. That sign does not continue on forever. So here's a point and here's a point and the line stops. And then our last one for this page says a ray. A ray is part line segment. A ray says it has one end point and the other end continues on. So you can see here F stops, it does not have an arrow. But G continues on. And because this one has a direction, we only read it one way. We call it ray FG. So we start with the letter where the line ends, and we can say the second letter of where it continues on. So it is ray FG. And we model that by FG and then a line over the top with an arrow going one direction. If my arrow were to go the other direction, then I would model it with my arrow going the other direction. So now it says activity 1, we're going to draw and label line JK. Well, if we look at this symbol, we see that it doesn't have any arrows to the left or to the right or both, so we know that that is a line segment because there's no arrows continuing on. And we know that it is labeled JK. So I'm going to draw a line with a point on each end to show that my line stops because it's a line segment, and I'm going to label one end J and one end K. Please make sure you draw that picture like mine. Underneath it says, is there another way to name JK? And remember that we said on a line segment, we can label it either direction because the line stops. So instead of calling it JK, I could call it line KJ with a line segment over the top of it because it goes in both directions. So the line segment goes both directions. Please make sure you have all of that written down on your paper. Your paper should match my paper. All right, fourth graders, on our next page, we're going to talk about angles. When we put lines together in different directions, we form angles. Angles are formed by two rays or line segments that have the same end point, and we call it a shared vertex. So that means where they meet together, like this letter Q. The two lines meet together at the letter Q. And we know that these ones are rays because they travel off in one direction. So there are two rays that meet together at one end point. So when we read this, we know that our vertex is Q. And so we call the whole thing by its vertex. We call it angle Q. But we can also call it by each individual point. So we could call it angle PQR, or we could go the other direction, angle RQP. But we need to make sure that every time there's a point, it has a label. And when we write an angle, we write a little sideways triangle, almost like a less than sign or a greater than sign, but it just tells us this is an angle. We're talking about the angle Q. So here's an example of an angle. It's a slice of pizza. So here's our vertex, and we can have a ray going off this side and a ray going off this side. Now, when we make an angle, we have different types of angles. We have big angles or little angles, and you've seen these before. So when we have an angle, like on the side of a piece of paper or in the corner of a room, where it meets together and makes a square, we call that a right angle, because that is exactly 90 degrees. So we know that that is a square angle, like a square shape. When we have two rays, almost like a line, that go in opposite directions, but notice that this line has an end point in the middle, so we're talking about it, we call that a straight angle because it forms a straight line. If I have an angle less than 90, I call that an acute angle. You can think of it like, oh, a cute little angle, because it's so small, right? So it's a acute angle. It's less than 90. But when I have more than 90, I call that an obtuse angle. It is greater than a right angle, but less than a straight angle. Please make sure that all of our notes that are written on the page are written on your page. We're going to practice labeling these angles and these lines and shapes tomorrow in class. Good job, fourth graders. You're almost finished. When you're sure you understand this lesson, go back to your teacher's website and complete the exit slip. See you tomorrow.